I have now just about the easiest task in the world. The task of introducing Robert Heinlein to a few thousand science fiction readers who already know him, who have probably met him these past few days. But rather than take the easy way out, rather than merely announcing his name and whistling and clamping and stomping along with the rest of you, I choose to pull rank on you. I choose to assert my seniority. In the figurative sense, I've known him Would somebody be kind enough to close that door? Thank you. In the figurative sense, I've known him longer than most of you. Not all of you, but most of you. In the figurative sense, I've known him for 37 years. I was reading and writing fan letters to Astounding Science Fiction when Heinlein's first two short stories appeared there in August and November 1939. That's how long I've known him. But there is more, and my seniority does not rest simply on that. I knew him as Lyle Monroe when he published under that byline in 1940 and 1941. I knew him as Caleb Saunders when he appeared under that name in 1941. I knew him as Anson MacDonald in 1941 and 42. I was reading a splendid magazine called Unknown Worlds when John Riverside was published there in 1942. I knew him by his proper name when he appeared at the Denver World Science Fiction Convention in 1941 and introduced that term time binding into fandom. I knew him at the Portland, Oregon World Convention in 1950 when his picture Destination Moon was previewed to that convention audience. I knew him in 1952 when he selected one of my short stories to be included in his anthology, Tomorrow the Stars. And finally, I came to know him in person. After knowing him, reading him for so long a time, I finally met him at the Chicago World Convention in 1962. Then, as now, I was the Toastmaster who introduced people and garbled names. Then, as now, I was the person who opened the envelope and read the names of the Hugo winners. I finally met Robert Heinlein in 1962 when he came up on the stage to accept his Hugo for Stranger in a Strange Land. Theodore Sturgeon was the guest of honor at that convention. Theodore Sturgeon was on the stage with us and offered several warm remarks about Robert Silverberg, which I like and will repeat. Pardon? Robert, I apologize. Smooth. Theodore Sturgeon offered several warm remarks about Robert Heinlein, which I like and will repeat. In his guest of honor speech, Sturgeon said this: "I'll tell a story on Heinlein. Perhaps I shouldn't, but this will give you an idea of what kind of a man he is. I went into a terrible dry spell one time, a slump. It was a desperate dry spell, and an awful lot depended on me getting writing again. Finally, I wrote to Robert Heinlein. I told him my troubles. I said that I couldn't write. And perhaps it was that I had no ideas in my head to begin a story. By return airmail, and I don't know how he did it, I got back 26 story ideas. Some of them ran on for a page and a half. Some of them were only a line or two. I mean, here were story ideas that some writers would give their left ear for. Some of them were merely suggestions, just little hints, lines that will spark a writer, like this one, quote, "Ghost of a little cat padding around eternity looking for a familiar lap to sit in." And this is still Ted Sturgeon speaking. This mechanical, chrome-plated Heinlein has a great deal of heart. I had told him my writing troubles, but I hadn't told him of any other kind of troubles. Clipped to that stack of story ideas was a check for $100 and this scribbled note, quote, "I have a suspicion your credit is bent." Good people, dear hearts, our guest of honor, Kansas City, 1976, Robert Heinlein. From this point on, I say no more. My role is done.
Mr. Tucker brought this in 10 minutes early. I agreed that I would not speak more than 30 minutes, so on a prorata of that, as close as I can do it in my head without one of those little punch things, I will set this for 25 minutes. Now, when this goes ping, that's a period. All done. Pow. It's great to be back. I left Kansas City 51 years ago. My best friend took me to dinner in the biggest, fanciest hotel west of the Mississippi, the Mulebach. I did not expect to return in this fashion. I went off to be a naval officer. There's a long, long list of writers who became writers because that was all they could do. And there is very little use for an ordnance engineer or a gunnery officer in the midst of the Depression when he's in such shape that he can't take an 8-hour day job. So like Robert Louis Stevenson, H.G. Wells, and a long list, I became a writer because it was the only way that I could see that I could make money without actually stealing. Where was I? first time I spoke as a guest of honor in 1941, my subject was the discovery of the future. And about all that I had to say in too many thousands of words was to expect the unexpected. Change, 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 lots of change. Perhaps the most useful thing to the reader of science fiction is that he is not as subject to future shock as other people. On that occasion, I made a certain number of predictions. One of them was as easy as looking down the street, seeing a streetcar coming. We had them there then. The principal change I've seen in 12th Street is that they've taken the streetcars out to the middle of the street. Seeing the streetcar coming and predicting that it was going to arrive. About the only definite prediction I made in 1941 was that we were about to get into a major war. I won on that one. I would rather have lost. By the way, everything's up to date in Kansas City, and they built a skyscraper 7 stories high. Those of you who are staying in any of the convention hotels can step out onto Baltimore, look to the north, you will see the street blocked by that same skyscraper 7 stories high, about as high as a building ought to go, that song talked about. If you haven't noticed it yet, if, as is the case with some of you, you have yet to see daylight in Kansas City. Before you leave, step out on Baltimore and take a look, because although it has been nearly 3/4 of a century since that building was built, it is still a magnificent edifice, even though it is surrounded by things that dwarf it, like the description in H.G. Wells, when The Sleeper Awakes, when he speaks of St. Paul's completely dominated by this great megalopolis of his imagination. That is the way the skyscraper 7 stories high looks now, but it's still beautiful. If you have been seeing only the night in Kansas City, I hope you have seen some of its nightlife, because this is the place from which show business starts. A great many people have regarded this as a great place to be from. Jean Harlow, I used to deliver the Kansas City Journal to the Carpenters, whose daughter, Arlene Carpenter, later was to be Jean Harlow. On up the street from where I lived was the home of the Powells. Their son, William Powell, had already left. He went to the same high school I did, the same high school Sally Rand went to. Her name was Helen Beck in those days, but William Powell was about 12, 13 years senior to me in that high school, but belonged to the same Central Shakespeare Club. I was in that club, and I took part in the literary contest there, primarily in public speaking, for one reason, and that was because I was then and am still a stammerer. Do I have any brothers or sisters here who also stutter or stammer? I can't see out there. Are there any? I can't see your hands. Yell. Very well then, all of you. all of you who are not troubled with stuttering or stammering, if I stop and whistle, go ahead and laugh at what doesn't bother me, and it shouldn't bother you, because that will break the stammer and I can go ahead. That is also the reason for the pauses in the voice. Also from Kansas City, Noah Beery, Wallace Beery. Oh, the list is endless. Half of show business comes from Kansas City, and anyone who thinks that writing science fiction is not show business is out of their, no, I can't say that. Speaking of one thing that science fiction is, though, I want to meet the chap who said that you could write science fiction without science. This reminds me of a cartoon in the New Yorker which appeared about 1928, in which a clerk is saying, now here is an excellent gin, non-alcoholic, of course. Anyone who thinks science fiction can be written without science deserves to go and room with the person who thinks that historical novels can be written without a knowledge of history. But it also has to be fiction. It has to be a story. And that is what someone was, I'm all mixed up. Yeah, there are only two things, there's only one thing I'm worrying about, only one thing I'm unsure about, whether I collapse first or civilization collapses first. Jenny and I have been in sort of a rush for some time now. On the plane coming out, there was a man over here, next aisle, who was going, and just a moment, sir, excuse me, I'm a clinical psychologist. Why are you doing like this? And he answered me, why do I do like this? And I answered, yes, why do you do like that? This is how I tell time. Well, I said to him, what time is it? He said, it is now exactly 3:23. I said, it's 3:31. He said, it is. That's the shape Jenny and I have been in for quite some time now. We've been not quite catching up. We have felt somewhat in the predicament of the man who got to be 21 years old before he had his first birthday. Now, you all know about this. Oh. Well, it happened that he was born on the 29th of February, 1896. So along comes 1897, he's got no birthday. 98, 99, 1900, what happens then? No leap year, he missed that one. Along came 1904, and his parents, who were in what we now call the Foreign Service, but was then the Consular Service and the Ambassadorial Service, were stationed in Russia, just at the time that the transition was made so that in moving they went from the Gregorian calendar to the Julian calendar, and he got wiped out again. Well, being in a family that moved around in that fashion, he then should have had one in 1908. They crossed the date line going west, which puts me in mind that Jenny's, how old are you now? Well, in any case, she had a birthday coming, her birthday matches up with that of Shakespeare, since she won't tell me how old she is, but it's the same day of the year. We were coming from Tasmania to Pearl Harbor, and we stopped in at New Caledonia, where I wanted to look into some operations, matters of medical interest that I was concerned with, and also to look over an airstrip that my brother had built there during the 1940s. And this causes you, in a departure from New Caledonia to Pearl Harbor, to go slunch-wise. And it's never a perfect great circle, and the navigator happened to be a close friend of mine. We had made several voyages in the same ship, and I said, George, science fiction fan, by the way, I said, George, what day are we crossing the date line? And he said, well, I said, isn't it just about April 22nd? And he thought about it. He said, I think it might be. And he saw me a few hours later with a big grin on his face, and he says, yes, it turns out it's April 22nd. So, sure enough, we crossed the date line on April 22nd. So Jenny got to be 2 years older this year. Now, she won't tell me how old she is, but whatever it is, she's 2 years older than she was last year. But this wasn't nearly as complicated as the situation of the man who, through no fault of his own, found himself simultaneously married to both of his grandmothers. But I wanted to get back, before we get this chap that was missing out on the birthdays. He kept having these things happen to him. It happened to him again in such a fashion that he finally got up, missed his 16th birthday, and he was 20 years old before he had his first birthday cake. Now, do you put one candle on it at that point, or what? In 1941, I did predict a war. That wasn't very hard to do. Along came 1961, I predicted a war again. And I did have some mistaken ideas about that, as to when it would happen. But this is the 200th anniversary of this, our republic. In all of that time, while we tend to think of peace as a normal condition, if you will look into the actual history of this country, you will find that we have been fighting in 199 of those years. For example, the late war in Korea was the second war we had with Korea, not the first. Go look it up. You'll find I'm speaking accurately. It surprised me the first time I saw the battle-torn flags at the Naval Academy when I went there as a plebe from Kansas City. 199 years in which we have been fighting, only 1 year of nominal peace. People worry about whether or not there is going to be an H-bomb or A-bomb war. Certainly there's going to be. There's going to be one, and there's going to be more than one. Don't kid yourselves. There will be wars. But the human race thrives on trouble. We're built for it. That's what we're good for. We wouldn't know how to get along without it. We are also going on out to the stars. I don't know what language will be used as the working language in that first starship. I would like it to be English, but that may be as much local patriotism as it is for me to be very happy to be back in my old hometown. My wife and I were traveling in the USSR some 18 years ago, I think it was. And at that time, we hit there at such a time that we were in Moscow at the time of the U-2 incident, but Господин Khrushchev kept it quiet. And by the time he decided what to do about it, we were out north of the Himalayas, about 2,500 kilometers from the nearest U.S. consul, and no other tourists around. And at that point, it was announced, and it felt very lonely. But things quieted down after a bit, and we found ourselves in Riga, I think it was, where we were entertained by the Union of Soviet Writers. Now, all during the trip, we'd been toasted here, there, and yon, on collective farms, anywhere. The toast would always be to Tavarish Khrushchev, to Mr. Eisenhower, Mir o Mir, peace to the world. And every time they found that when Jenny could speak fluent Russian, they always decided she was of Russian descent. And I would explain, no, nothing of the sort. She'd learned it at night school at the University of Colorado and had studied it very hard, and that was why she could speak Russian so well. In fact, we had a saying in our country that the optimists were learning Russian and the pessimists were learning Chinese. Well, I think that accounts for why I was out in my timing on my last prediction. On even-numbered days, I get up in the morning and say, thank God for Russia. And on odd-numbered days, I get up and say, thank God for China. It's something like this Trojan point balance. As long as all 3 points are there, it stays in an uneasy but nevertheless stable balance. I don't know how long that might last. But don't kid yourself that there will not be war. And don't kid yourself that there will not be survivors. The most ridiculous statement I've ever heard is one that was attached to a splinter political party. Peace and freedom, peace and freedom. You can have peace or you can have freedom, but you don't get both at once. Yes, I heard both the applause and the boos. The only way a man can be free is by an utter willingness to fight with the outright viciousness of one of Larry Niven's Gazzitti. The only peace that a man who won't fight ever gets is the peace of the grave. And sometimes those who fight get it too, but this is the primary function of what otherwise is a genetically spoiled female. Wait a minute, thank God, not his primary function. His secondary function is to fight in defense of women and children. And yes, I can hear the boos too. And to those of you who booed, presently you will find that I am right. A great many of us are going to have only two choices, either not to fight and die or to fight and die. But nevertheless, there will be survivors. I learned that from Billy Lai, a great and wise man, Billy. He said, Robert, there are always survivors. No matter how bad it is, there are always survivors. And that is how the human race develops. That fits right in with this business of going on out to the stars. The human race is going to break again into two pieces. Homo, Terrans, and I can't get the Latin straight now. I've got my Latin expert down here, and I won't attempt to it, but man of the stars. It's going to be the same sort of a situation that we had starting here from Westport Landing, on out to Westport, and on out the tracks across the Kansas prairies. I don't know which way I'm oriented here. Which way is north? Somebody local here, point out north for me. Where? I'm facing north. All right. And they went off this way. There was an expression about it at that time. The cowards never started, and the weaklings died on the way. And that is what will happen with the human race with respect to going on out into space. And I think one of the happiest things that happened at this convention was to have Viking 2 land successfully right in the middle of it. And then there was this matter of, I made one other bad prediction when I was asked to do so in 1950 to make up some. I said we would cure our housing, make a breakthrough on housing surely by this time. I was dead wrong. Between various special interests, most of the United States is still living in houses that could have been built just as well and sometimes better in the Roman Empire. We have the most modern of electronic devices housed in things that are a little better than masonry tents. Good night.
My last act is to kiss you again. When I told the Kansas City committee that I would accept this job, they asked me what my fee was.
Since Mr. Tucker has decided to say no more, he will say no more. Good night and thank you.